Right, so here we are again. Israel drops the bombs, then drops the lie to justify it, and Benjamin Netanyahu couldn't leap at the chance fast enough. This time it was Rafah, two Israeli soldiers killed, as it happens, by their own bulldozer, hitting some of their own unexploded ordnance. But no, it was Hamas, it was proclaimed. They're in the tunnels again. It never ceases to amaze me how they can obliterate all of these buildings above ground, yet these tunnels are ever present. They never ever seem to end up collapsing, do they? What did collapse for several hours at least was the ceasefire itself, of course, the truth buried under the same rubble that buried Israel's victims. Netanyahu didn't just jump the gun, he built an entire justification to end the ceasefire, paint Hamas as breaching the terms of it, even though Israel had done that 47 times up until that point, and actually, it all turned out to be a friendly fire accident. So once again, we can say it wasn't Hamas that broke the ceasefire, it was an Israeli government so depraved and desperate to resume their own genocide that it mistook its own accident for a gift from God. Right, so the ceasefire announced in Sharm el-Sheikh on the 9th of October was meant to end one of the most destructive phases of the Gaza genocide, wasn't it? 2 years of it. Will this finally be the ceasefire that leads to permanent peace? Mediated by Egypt, Qatar, Turkey and the US, it promised a halt to hostilities, phased prisoner exchanges and a monitored flow of humanitarian aid. For 10 days, the ceasefire has held, mainly because Israel can get away with repeatedly breaching it, as they've done from day one. Then in Rafah, an explosion ended up killing 2 Israeli soldiers. And within hours, the truce was apparently gone. The official story claimed Hamas had broken it, so the media dutifully carried the joyous news that Israel was now justified in resuming the very atrocities it hadn't actually ever stopped committing. Yet the evidence now shows that Israel was again at fault. But that didn't stop them building more warfare based on a lie. From the first minutes, the state's narrative moved faster than the facts ever could. Israeli military spokespeople told domestic media that terror operatives had fired on soldiers near Rafah. Benjamin Netanyahu convened his security cabinet and authorised what his office called forceful strikes. Air raid sirens sounded across Gaza before any investigation could possibly occur. Hospitals recorded dozens of civilian deaths within a single day. Hamas issued an immediate denial. Its political bureau confirmed that Rafah remained an Israeli-controlled red zone with no active Palestinian units, all behind the yellow line. The denial was, of course, ignored, though. The bombing continued. Hamas was in the tunnels. Within hours, though, US officials privately concluded that Israel's version of events was false. Yes, even the US were admitting it. The Rafah blast had not been caused by Hamas or any other Palestinian faction. A military bulldozer had hit unexploded ordnance, Israel's own munitions, during clearance work. 2 soldiers died on the spot. Yet despite knowing this, Netanyahu's government maintained the story of a Hamas attack and used it to relaunch the genocide. That single act, a lie told to cover an accident, detonated far beyond Rafah did. It collapsed an internationally guaranteed ceasefire, froze humanitarian aid, and killed almost 100 citizens in the first week alone. The Rafah lie became both the justification and the method of renewed aggression. The explosion occurred inside Israeli-controlled territory. The accusation against Hamas was made immediately, without evidence. The bombing campaign began within hours. Israel never presented missile fragments, launched coordinates or radar data that proved this was a Hamas strike. Yet then, as Washington confirmed the internal cause, the claim quietly disappeared from Israeli briefings, and Netanyahu must have grudgingly, I dare say, called things off. This was not confusion, it was calculation, the decision to weaponize an internal mistake to destroy an inconvenient truce. Netanyahu's political circumstances made that calculation inevitable. His coalition is fracturing under the weight of far-right partners. Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir have already condemned the ceasefire's weakness. Smotrich posted one word on social media: war. The war hawk Avigdor Lieberman called for a true iron wall policy. The political message aimed at Netanyahu is unmistakable, therefore. A leader who maintained the ceasefire will be a leader who would have to fall. Netanyahu, of course, also faced the resumption of his corruption trial. Court hearings scheduled for that week were conveniently suspended once airstrikes began again, though, a cold having kept him from them before that. War again providing political sanctuary for him, and so Rafa gave him both a diversion and an opportunity to resume aggression. Israel justified all of it as retaliation for Hamas fire. The fire it knew it had never happened. The words changed, but the logic held. If there are explosions, Hamas must be to blame, and therefore any response is legitimate. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who had spent weeks threatening rebellion, publicly backed the renewed assault and dropped their criticism of Netanyahu's leadership for the time being. The political crisis ended the moment the bombing resumed. What had looked like division was replaced by a single chant for war. This alignment of domestic necessity and military aggression is not new. Each major Israeli escalation has followed periods of political vulnerability. 2012's Pillar of Defence, 2014's Protective Edge, 2019's Guardian of the Walls. When public legitimacy erodes, bombardment ends up restoring it. Rafa fits the same rhythm, with the added cynicism that the spark came from Israel's own ordnance. By acting on a lie it knew to be false, the government destroyed what little credibility remained in its ceasefire commitments. The deception turned the truce into a trap, first for Gaza, then for what is left of Israel's own reputation. Reversal was achieved. The state that accused Hamas of betrayal ended up exposing its own. The lie was supposed to save Netanyahu. Instead, it marked the moment his narrative blew up in his face yet again. Washington's reaction confirmed the complicity. US officials confronted Israel privately after verifying the Rafa blast was self-inflicted. Publicly, they said nothing. Donald Trump's comment that Hamas has been doing some shooting, we think maybe the leadership isn't involved, was a masterclass in ambiguity. It preserved Israel's cover story while allowing the bombing to carry on. For the mediators of Egypt and Qatar and Turkey, the silence was humiliating. Each had guaranteed the truce. Each watched it collapse without consequence. Egypt's government avoided confrontation. Qatar expressed concern. None invoked breach clauses or demanded investigation. Under international humanitarian law, ceasefires are binding. Attacking civilians or obstructing humanitarian aid during one constitutes a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. Israel's reimposed blockade and airstrikes on civilian infrastructure therefore violate both the ceasefire and international law. The deliberate use of a false justification adds another layer as well: perfidy. The act of feigning adherence to a truce to gain military advantage. If a state discovers that its own ordnance caused a blast, but uses that incident to resume hostilities, it commits precisely that offence, and that is what we've seen. Historically, the Rafah episode fits a familiar pattern. In 2008, an Israeli raid that killed 6 Hamas members ended in this existing truce and led to Operation Cast Lead. In 2014, the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teenagers, initially blamed on Hamas leadership but later found to be the act of an unauthorized cell, was the declared trigger for Operation Protective Edge. In 2023, the Al Ali hospital bombing, first attributed to Islamic Jihad before evidence ended up contradicting that claim, reinforced the same method of accusation followed by quiet retraction. Rafa, this year in 2025, repeats this same pattern once again: an incident, a claim, an escalation, and then eventual exposure. Each and every time the world moves on before there's any accountability. Each time the cost is paid by the civilians. Each time the lie becomes policy. Statistics cannot convey the disorientation of those who believe the ceasefire meant safety. Families in Gaza have begun returning to their homes, sweeping dust from concrete floors, trying to rebuild their lives, some reopening market stalls and rebuilding walls that no longer have roofs. Schools reopened in tents. For 10 days they believed the worst might have passed. Rafa matters far beyond Gaza because it demonstrates that a ceasefire mediated by the US can be destroyed by fabrication without penalty. States that watched Rafa unfold will remember that an international guarantee meant nothing once Israel chose to violate it yet again at that. Rafa eroded not only trust in Israel's commitments, but in the entire architecture of Western-sponsored diplomacy. If this truce could be killed by a lie, then any of their truces can be. Mainstream coverage followed the familiar path of repetition first, correction never. Global networks led with the headline "Ceasefire in doubt after Hamas attack." When Hamas denied involvement, those headlines remained unchanged. By the time alternative outlets published the bulldozer revelation, the narrative had already hardened. The suppression of contradiction becomes near total. Major US and European outlets did not reference the drop site report by Ryan Grimm or the White House's own findings. Instead, they shifted language to renewed hostilities and fragile calm shattered, phrases that obscure where the responsibility actually lies. What Rafa confirms is a system, not an error. The transformation of accidents into pretexts is now an established mechanism of Israeli strategy. When deterrence wanes or political pressure rises, a managed escalation restores control. The steps rarely change: incident, accusation, bombardment, and then erasure. In 2025, that sequence has just been caught in real time, yet the result is the same. The ease with which the deception succeeded shows how completely accountability has been hollowed out. The Rafa deception is not an aberration, it's the purest expression of a doctrine that sees truth as expendable once strategic need demands violence. For Netanyahu, the lie worked only in the short term, though. Domestically, it united his coalition for a bit again and postponed his trial for a bit again. Internationally, it exposed his government's dependence on deception, and yet the leaks from the US officials confirmed what Israel hoped to bury. The very justification he'd chosen became evidence of bad faith. And this is the reversal at the heart of the story. The attempt to manufacture legitimacy ended up destroying it. Israel's narrative of victimhood imploded under its own evidence. The lie that was supposed to defend its image now ends up defining it. What does Rafa leave behind? A humanitarian catastrophe, a discredited ceasefire process, and a moral precedent that truth is optional for those with sufficient power. It tells every future belligerent that facts are irrelevant once alliances align. It tells every civilian under bombardment that law's symbolic, and it tells every journalist that evidence without amplification changes nothing. The question left hanging is how long the world's leaders intend to keep on pretending not to know. We all do. The Rafah explosion began as an accident before rapidly becoming an excuse. Israel's leadership took a mistake of its own making, blamed its enemy for it out of convenience and opportunism, and bombed a captive population to prove their lies were true. The United States learned the truth, then suppressed it and shielded the perpetrator. The mediators stayed silent. The mainstream media looked away. That sequence from deception to destruction is now the blueprint for how power operates in an era without accountability. The facts are simple. A bulldozer hit unexploded ordnance. 2 soldiers died. Hamas did nothing. Israel blamed Hamas, and then they bombed anyway. The ceasefire did not collapse here naturally. It was deliberately killed off the moment the opportunity arose. Every civilian killed after the 19th of October is traceable to that moment. Every aid truck stopped at the border, every hospital left in the dark, every promise of peace broken stems from a single decision to convert an error into an opportunity to renew atrocities and save Netanyahu's political skin. The ceasefire is back in place because this time the US didn't play ball, but only so far as Israel pay any attention to it anyway, and only until the next opportunity arises for Netanyahu to try to bring it down again. And this all came, of course, hot on the heels of news that other incidents being blamed on Hamas and stories of Hamas operatives fighting again and violating the ceasefire, when in actual fact it's Israeli-funded and armed militias within Gaza that are responsible for that. So get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.